In the 17th century, feathers were fired in the air to bring peace on a marriage. So it was in 1623, when Sir Robert Harley took Brilliana Conway to be his bride. Yet within a generation, the same guns will be fired in anger, and wedding guests and family will be at each other's throats. Sir Robert's servants will be brutalized. His children will be dragged away to prison, and his bride, Brilliana, will be dead. In 1640, only 4 men in England knew how to fire a mortar cannon. In the 8 years that followed, England suffered proportionately a greater loss than in the First World War. How a peaceful people descended into brutality is told in the words of those who lived through the English Civil War. England in the early 17th century was a prosperous and well-ordered land.
Here markets are good and victuals never dear. Each home is filled with plenty all the year. The ground manured, the grain doth so increase that thousands live in wealth and blessed peace.
In the 100 years since England had broken with the Church of Rome, the country had largely come to accept that the official religion was the Protestant Church of England, with the king at its head.
Hear the word of the Lord, as in the good book. I charge you all now to turn unto the book of the...
But among devout Protestants was a growing number of people with more fundamental beliefs. Lady Brilliana Harley and her husband Sir Robert were Puritans. They believed the Bible, now widely available in pocket form, gave them a direct line to God. To Puritans, ritual and ornament were obstacles to the true godly religion. They were loyal to the king, but wanted his church purged of all relics of Catholicism. The young Brilliana had another preoccupation, her firstborn son, Ned. When Ned had grown up and gone away to Oxford University, she wrote to him almost every week.
My sweet Ned, I hope these lines find you well. I earnestly desire that from all the flowers of learning you may draw the honey. You are well beloved. Therefore I cannot help but tell you I miss you.
Lady Brilliana's letters to Ned survive, nearly 400 years on. They're kept by her grandson 8 times removed, also Edward Harley.
The letters contain these lovely everyday things about what's going on at home, but beneath that there's a very strong undercurrent of wanting to try and improve her son. I don't think he was in so much need of improvement, but I think it's very much part of her nature that she wanted to tell him about the news of the day.
I am sending you a book of news, as I would willingly have your mind keep awake in the knowledge of things abroad.
The news from abroad was bad. In Germany, Catholic soldiers were massacring Protestant civilians as the 30 Years' War reached a peak of savagery. to Puritans particularly. It confirmed all their fears about the malign power of Rome. Living in another world from Brilliana Harley, but also a Puritan, was wood-turner Nehemiah Wallington. He was a devoted father of 5, but only one of his children survived to adulthood. The family all lived in his workshop in the city of London near St. Paul's. For Wallington, Germany was a long way off, but what brought it close was a new fashion: illustrated news books.
I had a book come to my hand of the miserable estate of Germany, wherein, as in a glass, you might see the mournful face of this our sister nation, now drunk with misery. They were tied about their heads with cords till the blood come out at their eyes, and they have hung up some in the smoke, drying them with small fires. Burning matches were put to their tongues and breasts. Those parts that nature hideth they filled with gunpowder, and giving fire to it they have in a horrible manner burst their bellies and killed them.
Wallington faithfully copied all he read into hand-stitched books. The surviving 2,600 pages provide the basis of his story.
Wallington is terrified by these news stories, and he imagines similar atrocities happening at home. He's obsessed with the news. And the reason for this is because political conflict, unlike anything seen before, is breaking out. Now, there isn't a domestic news press that publishes British news because the government, Charles and his advisors, are very concerned about the dangers represented by popular discourse about news. And so, effectively, censorship maintains a silence on those issues.
When Charles I came to the throne, many believed he not only ruled by divine right, but had divine powers.
When His Royal Majesty did come to our town, my mother that was sick with the scrofula did go to visit the royal progress so that she could be blessed by the king and touched by his royal hand. His Majesty did bless a silver sixpence, which he did give to her, and ever after she was cured.
Despite the awe in which the king was held, Puritans, working in secret, were printing hostile pamphlets about his queen.
Henrietta Maria is a tiny, vivacious, chirpy, happy, and loves court entertainments. In personal terms, she is a sweetie. The only weakness that the Queen has, and it's a crushing one, is that she has the wrong religion.
For Wallington, who'd only previously read the Bible, anything printed had to be true. He believed the pamphleteer's spin that it was the Queen who now ruled at court.
The king, being in full conjunction with this popish planet, the Queen, he is totally eclipsed by her counsel.
I do hear it said that she hath brought with her popish priest from France, and doth routinely hold mass at court. It's a great affront to our nation and our church.
Another target of the pamphleteers was the Archbishop of Canterbury, William Laud. A few years before, Laud had decided to reform the Church of England, taking it back much closer to the old Catholic practices. Laud spoke of the beauty of holiness. He wanted the very things the Puritans abhorred: communion conducted behind rails, rich adornments, statues, and stained glass windows. The Archbishop of Canterbury was the king's censor-in-chief. But Laud could no longer keep Puritan pamphlets off the streets.
It says the Archbishop's conscience convicted for his evil intents to pollute the church with the corruption that is Roman Catholicism.
Laud fought back. Puritans caught publishing illegal pamphlets had their ears cut off by the hangman. The press retaliated. One popular pamphlet from 1641 shows Laud dining off those ears.
The Civil War is one of the first propaganda wars in history. It would have been unthinkable for either side to start it without using the resources of the printing press and without mounting rival campaigns to convince people who were listening to printed propaganda read by others or reading it themselves that a cause was worth supporting, if not actually dying for.
By 1640, the king was heading for a showdown with his enemies. For 11 years, he had run the country without consulting Parliament. Many MPs felt that this was an abuse of royal power. Now, with trouble brewing in Scotland and Ireland, Charles needed money to raise an army to impose his will. And that meant recalling Parliament. For the king, it was a disastrous move. As soon as Parliament was gathered, its members began pushing through laws on their own account. And they pounced on the king's personal advisors. On the 18th of December 1640, Archbishop Laud, the king's favourite, was impeached on 23 charges of treason and imprisoned. The end of Laud meant the end of censorship. All restrictions were lifted from the fledgling press. The battle for public opinion was joined in earnest. The tensions were then ratcheted upwards by grotesquely exaggerated stories that Catholic peasants in Ireland had begun attacking their Protestant landlords.
They came to an Englishman's house, where they slew the man at the door. And afterward they entered the house, where they found the woman and her maid a-brewing. The mistress they took, and they threw her into a boiling cauldron or pan of wort that was over the fire. And her mistress they slew, cut off her head, and afterward fired the house.
These lurid reports swept across the country. Brilliana Harley was loyal to the king, but fearful of Catholics.
I will hope the Irish papists do not attempt anything. Though I think it is not good to be too secure. What terrible fears there are in this kingdom.
Brilliana's husband, Sir Robert, was more than a fervent Puritan. He was chairman of the Parliamentary Committee for the Destruction of Idolatry. At home, he set an example by smashing the stained glass in neighbouring churches.
Sir Robert pulled down the cross and, causing it to be broken in pieces, laid it in the path to be trod on. He broke the windows of the church and chancel and smote the glass with a small hammer.
Back in London, Harley continued his work, destroying the windows in Westminster Abbey. All over the capital, Puritans followed suit, in a wave of destruction that Wallington hoped would lead to Puritan rule in England.
Some of these pieces I have kept as a remembrance, to show the generation to come what God hath done for us to give us such a reformation, that our forefathers never saw the like.
The country was rapidly becoming ungoverned, if not ungovernable. In November 1641, Puritan MPs drew up a list of 206 complaints against the king, called the Grand Remonstrance. Normally, such a document would have been presented privately to the king. This time, they passed over the king and gave it to the press to broadcast to the people.
His Majesty has for the last 12 months caused great dangers and fears.
Distempers and disorders which have overwhelmed and extinguished the liberty, peace and prosperity of his kingdom and the comfort and hopes of his good subjects.
And he has undermined the foundations and strength of his own royal throne in opposing the Parliament who have been the ease of those evils.
Pym, one of the authors of the Grand Remonstrance, is conducting secret negotiations with a London publisher. The following week, this publisher produces the first ever newspaper. This seems to be part of a big parliamentary propaganda exercise. We have the Grand Remonstrance on one hand, we have the first ever newspaper on the other.
The descent into conflict was unstoppable. At first, the king had had more popular support than the Puritan radicals in Parliament. But the parliamentary press and the king's impetuous reaction changed that. When the king tried and failed to arrest his enemies in the House of Commons, hostile mobs rose up against him.
Charles I was a small man whose nerve had been stretched to breaking point. He really believed now, wrongly, that his opponents in Parliament were actually trying to murder him and his family, and to use the London mob as a way of breaking through the traditional security of the palaces, of terrorising his supporters, and ultimately of menacing his person. When he fled London to start the Civil War, he was somebody literally on the run, in a blind panic, fearing for his very hide.
January 1642. The moment no one could have imagined 2 years before had arrived. The king abandoned his own capital and went north to raise an army against Parliament. The country began to divide between those who were for the king and tradition, largely in the rural north and west, and those on the side of the Puritan radicals who believed the king needed rescuing from Catholic plotters. They held London, the south and east, and the ports. The violence had begun. No one could remember when Colchester had last seen trouble on its streets. Now a mob of Puritans turned on the local dignitaries who supported the king.
Crowds, perhaps as many as 5,000, invade the house of Sir John Lucas, the local gentleman, and they proceed to systematically destroy it. And then they march into the chapel, they break open the tombs, snap apart the skeletons, cut off the hair and wear it in their hats, and march up and down the town, we're told, banging together these bones in a form of rough music. There's the world being turned upside down.
One bewildered Englishman wrote, "It is strange to note how we have slid insensible into the beginnings of a civil war by one expected accident after another." This was a conflict the majority did not want. The first deaths were not long coming. Thomas Winkles, a farm worker from the Northamptonshire village of Kilsby, was approached by a party of men who'd signed up to fight for the king. They asked him who he was for. He said, for the king and Parliament. They shot him at point-blank range.
As of this day, Monday of 22nd August 1642, His Most Royal Majesty brought forth his army and did set up his royal standard in the city of Nottingham.
Charles I had declared war on his parliament, and the nation began to divide. On one side, the Cavaliers who supported the king, on the other, the Puritan radicals who the Royalists insultingly called Roundheads. Most people in the country were horrified the war had come among them. For Lady Brilliana Harley, a Puritan in Royalist Herefordshire, peaceful life was ending. Her beliefs were under threat, and her family was being torn apart.
I see my brother Pelham is not of my mind. He is with the king. I therefore thank God my dear sister is taken from us, that she might not hear this news. For it would grate her heart.
Trained band of London, by the left hand about, and close your order.
Neremiah Wharton was a typical recruit to the parliamentarian side. He came from London, a hotbed of the propaganda that had turned Puritans against the king. His day job was in a tannery. The conflict had given young Wharton an enemy and a purpose.
Must be armed with a good musket. Cock your match. Try your match. Guard your pan and blow.
Word had gone out that men loyal to Parliament were needed in the north to face the king's armies. As he travelled, Wharton wrote letters to his adopted father.
Most worthy sir, every day our soldiers by stealth do visit papists' houses and constrain from them both meat and money. They give them whole great loaves and cheeses, which they triumphantly carry away upon the points of their swords.
But Wharton's band would soon discover there was more to war than being righteous hooligans.
This day at Wendover, the soldiers got into the church, defaced the ancient idolatrous glass pictures, and burned the Holy Communion rails. Accidentally, Captain Francis, this man forgetting he was charged with a bullet, went and shot a maid through the chest, and she immediately died. We marched on, sadly.
These callow young men were about to come up against experienced soldiers who already had blood on their swords. First among them was the king's nephew and commander of the Royalist army, Prince Rupert of the Palatinate. He was only 23, but he'd been brought up in Europe, a veteran of the religious wars that had devastated Germany.
Prince Rupert was in many ways an adolescent comic books hero. He's tall, he's handsome, he's dark, he's dashing. He is a military genius.
Rupert was a professional, and he was out to crush the enemy.
Take your men over there. You will take their right.
He wants to win this war fast, and he isn't too choosy about the methods he uses. And so to the English, he can look like the very worst sort of barbaric continental mercenary soldier, bringing all the savage methods of continental warfare to a land which had known nothing but peace for a generation, and indulging in practices that were downright un-English.
On the 23rd of October 1642, the two armies met at Edge Hill near Stratford-on-Avon to fight the first major battle of the Civil War. As Rupert lined up his royalist cavalry for a head-on charge, the professional's tool of modern war. On the parliamentarian side, the apprentices armed themselves with prayer.
Amen.
O sovereign Lord, as we go forth into battle this day, ye who be the ruler...
All day our chaplains of Christ preach to us. These with their sermons have already subdued more royalist spirits amongst us than 1,000 armed men could do, so that we have a great hope of a blessed victory.
October 23rd, 1642, being the Lord's Day in the forenoon, both the armies met in the valley near Kyneton, in the midway between Banbury and Stratford-on-Avon.
Rupert and his cavalry charged the parliamentarian lines and scattered all before them. But instead of returning to the fray to score a decisive victory, the Cavalier general took off, allowing the parliamentarians to regroup. In the confusion, there was no clear outcome. One thing we know for sure is that the letter Sergeant Wharton wrote on the eve of battle was his last.
Dear Master, I have gathered a little money together and today have made a soldier's suit for winter, edged with gold and silver lace. It is a great pride to me. I hope I will never stain it, unless in the blood of a cavalier.
In this war of religion, victory meant God was on your side.
Well, thank you.
So the propagandists had to find silver linings in every defeat. The parliamentary press spun Wallington the story he wanted to hear.
It says the slaughter in all was 5,517, but 10 on the enemy's side were slain, to every one of ours.
After his inconclusive victory at Edge Hill and a half-hearted attempt to march on London, the king retreated to Oxford. Oxford's citizens had come out for Parliament, the university for the king. As the Cavalier army marched in, a 12-year-old schoolboy, Anthony Wood, watched them occupy the city. Like Sergeant Wharton, he wrote a detailed account of what he saw.
This day, the King's Majesty, towards the evening, came from Edgehill on horseback with his army of footmen. They came in full march into the town with about 60 or 70 colours borne before them. At Christ Church College, the university stood to welcome His Majesty.
By the time the king turns up, Oxford's almost ceased to be a university. The country is so badly disrupted, a lot of students have gone home, either for their own safety or to take part in the war in their own locality.
Those left in the colleges had to make way for the king's court and the royalist army. New College, where Anthony Wood was a student, was requisitioned for the royal armoury.
The master of the school, with his scholars, were removed to the chorister's chamber at the east end of the common hall. It was a dark, nasty room and very unfit for such a purpose, which made the scholars often complain.
Prince Rupert was determined to make the city impregnable. He had houses around the perimeter walls blown up to ensure there was nowhere for the enemy to quarter. He reinforced the city walls, requiring everyone between the ages of 16 and 60 to work for free 1 day a week. Anyone who challenged the king's authority was imprisoned. If stories appearing in the parliamentary press were to be believed, for their captured soldiers, Oxford Prison was a death trap.
The dungeon is full of people. It stinks grievously. No lodging there but the bare ground, which we all piss and shit in. In some places, a man might go almost over his shoes in piss. Also, sick persons are forced in the same place to empty their stomachs, so that the stink of the place is enough to poison us. We petitioned again that the sick men might have nourishment convenient for their weak estates. The jailer answers us that they should have nothing, and if they died, should be cast on a dunghill. We see nothing but death before our eyes.
By the spring of 1643, parliamentary Roundhead supporters in the royalist county of Hereford were being made to feel unwelcome. With her husband away with Parliament, Lady Brilliana was isolated in her castle at Brampton Bryan. Her servants were loyal, but her neighbours increasingly hostile.
The county grows very insolent. In Ludlow they set up a maypole and a thing like a head on it, and gathered a great many about it, and shot at it in derision of Roundheads. Some of the maids being with me, some passing on their way to market, looked upon me and wished all Puritans and Roundheads hanged.
Ludlow's only 10 miles from here. It was a horrible thing for her to go, and I think there's sort of almost a feeling that this event was almost set up for Brampton Bryan, for her, to show that, you know, there was something that they weren't happy with, the stand that was being taken at Brampton Bryan. And the letter goes on, and towards the end, she says in the letter, and it's one of the first inklings that she's starting to get really quite worried about what's going on, and she says, I do not find myself safe at the moment.
An even greater worry was that her son Ned, now aged 18, had left Oxford and joined the parliamentary army. In a skirmish near Bristol, his horse had been shot.
I acknowledge the great mercy of my God that he preserved you when your horse was struck. As yet, I can get very little towards the buying of a new horse, but what there is, I send you.
Safe behind Oxford's defences, Charles I and his queen held court. Henrietta Maria had returned from a dangerous journey to Holland, where she sold the crown jewels to buy ammunition for the royalist army. She narrowly escaped with her life.
On one occasion, the cannonballs were singing around us in a fine style, and the sergeant was killed 20 paces from me. We placed ourselves under a shelter during 2 hours that they were firing upon us, and the balls passing always over our heads, and sometimes covering us with dirt.
The parliamentary press, incensed, went on the attack, calling her Her She Majesty Generalissima. But in the king's own new royalist paper, the Mercurius Aulicus, she was the force's sweetheart.
The tragedy of the marriage of Charles I and Henrietta Maria is that it's that rare thing, a totally happy royal partnership. Charles I may be all sorts of bad things, but he's an ostentatiously and firmly loving husband. He's faithful, he's fertile, they produce a nursery full of royal children to carry on the dynasty, and they adore each other.
The great blessing of the day was the Queen Majesty's safe coming to the city of Oxford, into which she made a most triumphant and magnificent entry.
When the Queen was in Oxford, the court erupted into gaiety. But there were dark shadows behind the revelry, and they were getting darker by the day.
For ordinary civilians, Oxford in the Civil War is either very exciting or a nightmare. It's very exciting because you have soldiers swaggering around the streets, and you have ladies and gentlemen of the court parading themselves in the college quads. But it's fearfully insanitary because the toilet provision of the place is hideously overstrained. People are forced to use things like chimney places and behind doors. And as a result of this, what you have is a city of linen, satin, lace and velvet, which sinks to high heaven.
Oxford was packed with soldiers festering with disease. Royalist camp follower Anne Harrison gave birth to her first child in Oxford. It died within days.
We, that had till that hour lived in great plenty and order, found ourselves brought to lie in a very bad bed. Day and night we hear the discourse of losing and gaining of towns and men, and see the spectacle of war, sometimes plague and sickness of other kind, by reason of so many people being packed together.
Plague masks, with their long beaks stuffed with herbs, were used to filter the unhealthy air. A physician, Dr. Thomas Willis, attempted to identify the new diseases.
This year, the year of my Lord 1643, there raged here a disease called morbidus campestris, of which many worthy persons died. About the summer solstice, this fever began to spread itself with worse attendance of symptoms, and to seize a great many. Whatever house it entered, it set upon the whole, so that there was scarce remaining in health to attend the sick.
Despite the plague, the royalist war machine gathered strength. The more he won, the more Rupert's exploits became the stuff of legend.
They do say that Prince Rupert's dog has powers to make itself invisible, so that he might spy for his master and go among the enemy and report back of his strategy. And Rupert himself be known to put on women's clothes.
By August 1643, the king seemed in reach of victory. His armies now moved south and west, mopping up resistance as they went. Brilliana Harley's castle lay in his path. A tiny Puritan island in a royalist sea. News of Rupert's approach was brought to her. She received a demand from the royalist commander in the area, once her guest and neighbour, to give up her castle to his troops. She wrote once more to her son Ned.
Dear Ned, I send you a copy of the summons that has been sent. It says if I do not give up my house, they will proceed against me as a traitor. There are 600 soldiers appointed to come and attack us.
As the English Civil War lasted into a second year, the mood was becoming uglier. Puritan was set against Royalist, and propaganda drove a wedge into the divide, persuading people their differences were much greater than they really were. The killing spread beyond the battlefields. Neighbour turned on neighbour. In June 1643, in her castle in Brampton Bryan, Lady Brilliana Harley received a summons demanding she surrender her home and her servants to the local royalist militia. She was a Puritan. Her husband was a parliamentarian activist. She refused.
When I saw how outrageously this county carries itself, my anger was so up, and my sorrow, that I had thought I should leave. But now I realize, if I go away, I will give up everything to the prey of our enemy. So I propose to stay as long as it is possible, if I live.
As royalist soldiers closed in, she prepared to defend herself. Years earlier, she drained the castle moat to make a garden. Now she decided to flood it again as a barrier against forced entry. She wrote to her eldest son, Ned, now serving in the Roundhead army.
Dearest Ned, the water is brought to our beautiful garden moat, our beautiful green court. I know it will trouble you, but it does not look as bad as you might suppose. We have had to do it in our defence.
Towards the end of 1642, it's quite clear that Brilliana's beginning to feel very isolated here in Herefordshire. Her servants have been assaulted, the park at Brampton Bryan has been broken into and animals have been stolen, the rents have been stopped completely, and she's starting to feel very worried about herself and about the safety of the people with her.
Now they say they will starve me out of my house. They have taken away our rents, and now they drive away the cattle. Their aim is to force me to let those men I have go. So then they might seize our house and cut our throats.
With royalist troops swarming through Hereford to join Prince Rupert's West Country campaign, Lady Brilliana was cut off. To continue communicating with her son Ned, she had to resort to desperate measures.
This rather extraordinary letter from Brilliana has been written in code and is a template which needs to be put on top of the letter, and she gives quite detailed instructions as to how to read the letter. You must pin that end of the paper which has the cross made in ink upon it, upon the little cross at the end of this letter. So here is the letter, and here is the template. Clearly the template would have been sent out in a different letter, and then one reads the words through. Without the template, it makes no sense whatsoever. I desire, imagine, to would pray, all, Hereford, your father, etc. Makes no sense whatsoever. And it's only when the template is put on top that it makes any sense. I desire you would pray, your father, to send me word what he would have me do. If I put away the men, I shall be plundered. And if I have no rents, I know not what course to take. If I leave Brampton, all will be ruined.
On the 27th of July, 1643, war came to Brampton Bryan. The captain of Lady Brilliana's musketmen kept a detailed report.
The enemy positioned themselves to take the castle. Some of their number came into the village below, where there was one born blind. He stood in their path. They asked who he was for, and he said, for the king's parliament. They presently murdered him.
Lady Brilliana had not expected the royalist assault to be so brutal.
The gentlemen of this county have effected their desires in bringing an army against me. What spoils have been done? The Lord preserve me from falling into their hands.
All day long they directed their fire upon us. We had but 50 musketeers. Until this moment, the honourable and gallant Lady Harley had lived upon her own in a peaceful and religious way until the malice of her enemies broke upon her. And I can tell you that many of the capon-faced cowards who had now unmanned themselves in offering violence to the good lady, not long ago had been guests to her table.
My thoughts are in a labyrinth to find out the reason why people should be thus to me. When I look at the many bonds by which most of the gentlemen of this county are tied to my husband by both blood and friendship, I do not know how all those I believe to be so good could break with the old obligations.
Upon the 3rd of August, the enemy burnt our mills. Most of the town was consumed and burnt, and they raised more batteries and rained down heavy fire upon us. We fought for our lives to strengthen our walls, but it was not enough. Upon the 7th in the afternoon, they planted another great gun against the west part of our castle. The 3rd shot came in at the window, shattered the walls, which hurt the Lady Colburn, striking out one of her eyes.
And as the siege evolved, it was pretty horrible. A lady in the castle was shot in the eye. The cook was shot with a poisoned bullet and he died in agony. And I think it was absolutely terrifying for her because the siege went on for 6 weeks, not a terribly big castle, and I think conditions were pretty awful.
Brilliana's father had been an advisor to the court. King Charles had been on first-name terms with her family. As she held out against his troops with her small garrison, she wrote imploring him to leave her home in peace.
By the petition of your humble servant Dame Brilliana Harley, I hereby vouch I did never offend your majesty, or ever take up arms against your majesty, or any of your majesty's subjects, nor have I performed any act of rebellion. I therefore humbly beseech you, return me the use of my home.
When the king's messenger arrived with his majesty's reply, Brilliana made him enter in a basket hoist over the ramparts. She was fearful royalist troops would attack if she opened her gates. The identity of the messenger filled her with hope. He was her husband's cousin. He'd been a guest at her wedding.
I am sorry that my condition is such that there is not a fairer way for me to invite you into my house as I should like. I shall with all readiness receive what your most gracious king is pleased to send.
We understand that Brampton Bryan Castle in our county of Hereford hath been and is made a receptacle and place of retreat to the rebels now in arms against us.
And a great terror to the county thereabouts by killing of divers of our good subjects, firing of houses and many other outrages. For these reasons we demand the said castle be immediately surrendered to us. Your good king is much mistaken. I never touched a soul nor fired a shot until his men came to me.
The siege continued. The age of chivalry was dying. Until now, the generals on both sides had followed the rules of war. But that changed on the night of Easter Monday, the 3rd of April, 1643, when Prince Rupert ordered his men to plunder Birmingham. A Birmingham Roundhead had shot one of the prince's favourite generals. That night, a third of the town was destroyed. Reports of the royalists' behavior shocked the country. In this war, where propaganda counted for so much, Rupert's deliberate attack was a gift to the parliamentarian press. Taking his cue from headlines of their inflated reports, Nehemiah Wallington called Prince Rupert Prince Robber.
Prince Robber, with 20,000 at least, marched into the town with his army and grievously plundered and burned, heathenishly ravishing women. The sad effects of which appears in some killing themselves, in others running out of their wits, until the sword drunk with blood is sheathed. 1,500, 2 days after, were buried.
The king begged Rupert to moderate his tactics for the damage they did to the royal reputation. But the sack of Birmingham marked a point of no return. The prince carried on. After Birmingham, the royalists planned to mop up all the cities of the West. Rupert now needed all the troops he could find. The siege of Brampton Bryan became an irrelevance. The royalists surrounding it were summoned for an attack on Gloucester. For Lady Brilliana, this was victory. Her castle remained intact, but her body had been broken. She wrote one last time to her son.
My dear Ned, how much I long to see you I cannot express. I have taken a very great cold that has made me very ill these 2 or 3 days. But I hope the Lord will be merciful to me in giving me my health, for it is an ill time to be sick in. I pray God bless you, and give me the comfort of seeing you, for you are the comfort of your most affectionate mother.
Brilliana Harley died on October the 31st, exhausted by the effort of defending her home and her family from the attack of those she had once called neighbours. She was 43. Three months later, the royalists returned. Her castle was destroyed. Her younger children led away to prison. February 1644, 2 years into a bloody civil war. England had become a landscape of disease, destruction, and death. Families everywhere were in mourning. Lady Brilliana Harley had been dead 3 months. Royalist soldiers returning to destroy her Herefordshire home attacked the garrison at nearby Hopton Castle. Sheltering inside were Lady Brilliana's former defenders. The Royalists forced their way in. They stripped the parliamentarians to the waist and hog-tied them back to back. One by one, they cut their throats. The Royalists then slit the throat of a maid. They forced another to watch her die. She was released to run 6 miles to Brampton Bryan and tell the parliamentarians there what to expect. En route, she went mad. All across the country, the catalogue of atrocities was growing, each exaggerated further in rival propaganda, each provoking yet another atrocity.
I'll speak They were killing, stripping and spoiling all they could meet with. Nothing heard but kill dead, kill dead.
Others, after they had surrendered, were dragged out of their houses to have their brains dashed out in the street.
A woman of good quality, after they had killed her husband, they took her in a rope and dragged her up and down.
This country that had known peace and order for over 100 years was now dominated by violence and confusion. London, where the conflict began, the heartland of Parliament's support. Even here, many saw little sense in what was happening. Puritan carpenter Nehemiah Wallington became a doubter. His journals show he no longer believed the war would lead to a better world.
This war has caused a flood of errors and schisms to break forth. And though I did think it good, I do fear for the future. I've received a letter from my good friend Edward Brown, that was my neighbour here in Cheapside. He did now reside in Ipswich, Massachusetts.
In America, Puritan exiles who had once fled England to reach a promised land were now watching closely.
My good friend, it concerns me much that I have not heard from you in this year of England's trouble. God doth much appear to us here. We have no trouble with the king because the way of God is revealed to us in the ways of men. Our governors here are fair-minded with their people.
Edward Brown lived 6,000 miles and a perilous sea voyage away. Like others, he had fled England a decade earlier to escape persecution by Archbishop Laud. Now his community was about to supply the revolutionary manpower that would change the course of the war. The colony of Massachusetts Bay was a haven for English Puritans. They believed God had called them there to build a new world founded on Puritan ideals. But as the stories of horror from home multiplied, some of these settlers had a new revelation. They now believed the time was ripe to take their mission back to Old England.
If you should see war described to you in a map, especially in a country well known to you, nay, dearly beloved of you, yea, where lately you dwelt, where you have many a dear friend and companion, how could you but lament and mourn? Let us fasten our eyes on the calamities of our brethren in Old England. Why, they are bone of our bone and flesh of our flesh in Christ. Oh, so their sorrows should be our sorrows, their miseries ours.
Amen. The sermons of William Hooke still survive. Originally from Exmouth in Devon, he exhorted the colonists to join the war and transplant American ideals to the old country.
Let it not be forgotten that of all the Christian peoples on this earth, we here today in this land enjoy greatest peace and tranquility. Amen.
Hooke sent inflammatory pamphlets back to England. New England's tears for Old England's fears advocated revolution.
We have taken spears and formed them into pruning hooks. Others have taken their pruning hooks and formed them into spears and taken their plowshares and forged them into swords. So shall our brethren go to war.
Amen. Hooke became a recruiting sergeant for the parliamentary cause. His revolutionary ideas had powerful support. The colony's governor was John Winthrop, founder of the city of Boston. Born in East Anglia, Winthrop persuaded 7 of the 9 students at the newly formed Harvard University to head to England and fight. One of them was his own son, Stephen.
Dear Father, Sir, the old England is in a very unsettled condition, and it is a wonder all falls not in pieces. But things are now upon a great turn, and I feel it is my duty to continue. For I do most assuredly believe that in this fight we have found a way of advancing God's kingdom.
Some trust in the might of princes, but we will put our trust Jehovah's authority.
With Stephen Winthrop came a preacher. His name was Hugh Peters, and he would turn rebellion into revolution. Most people on the parliamentary side wanted the monarchy tamed. Peters wanted it destroyed.
This army must uproot monarchy, not just here, but in France and all the kingdoms hereabouts. This army is the cornerstone cut from that mountain that will dash the powers of this earth to pieces.
Hugh Peters is somebody who in many ways has visited the Promised Land, which in his case is called America. He's actually seen a society functioning there which has a religion exactly the sort that he would like to have in the old country. And having given up the old country for lost as conquered by Satan, the opening of the Civil War gives Hugh Peters a chance to bring true religion back to England where it started, and this time make sure it stays forever.
Peters was a political revolutionary clothed as a man of God, a 17th century American Ayatollah. The son of a Cornish merchant, he became a Puritan fundamentalist at Cambridge University and a preacher in East Anglia. He fled England during the Puritan purges, taking with him his wife and only daughter. But the terror of the purges and the sea voyage were too much for Mrs. Peters. She lost her sanity. Back in England, Peters thirsted for vengeance on his old enemy, the instigator of the purges, the Archbishop of Canterbury. For 4 years, since he was impeached, Archbishop Laud had been in prison. Spurred on by Peters' revolutionary spirit, Parliament now put Laud on trial for his life.
Hugh Peters comes to see William Laud as a personal enemy, an embodiment of everything he hated most about the Church of England and about England itself, and which had caused him to give up England and abandon it earlier. In many ways, he sees that he can cut off the head of Archbishop Laud. One of the great blocks to godly reformation has been removed.
On the 10th of January 1645, Laud was found guilty of treason.
It's a signal to Charles that henceforth he can only have peace if he capitulates to Parliament's way of seeing English religion. In other words, no compromise possible over this. He simply has to do away with the church he wants and accept one founded upon Puritan principles.
On the afternoon of his sentence, the most important man in England next to the king was beheaded. For Peters, this was a triumph, a rehearsal for the fate of Charles I.
and ye accumulate unto yourselves trinkets.
To advance the revolution, the radical Puritans needed a properly trained professional force.
Shall turn into shackles to
Peters went on a fundraising crusade.
weigh ye down into
It was said his sermons even persuaded the Puritan faithful to part with their wedding rings.
Ye have been warned!
His efforts helped to produce the new model army. In the ranks of the old army, one leader stood out with the implacable conviction to carry this new army to victory. The 40-year-old MP for Huntingdon. His name was Oliver Cromwell.
Oliver Cromwell is a born-again Puritan, somebody who's ended up a working tenant farmer from a busted gentry family and has worked his way back to national life because of his sincere and newly acquired Puritan religious faith. So he's somebody who believes God has laid him low only to raise him up for great purposes. He is, in his own eyes and those of his supporters, an invincible man of destiny.
Under Cromwell, the reformed parliamentary army emerged. A uniformed, disciplined fighting machine. The red-jacketed new model army was united by belief and inspired by prayer. It began to win battles. Cromwell was everything the parliamentary propagandists had waited for.
Cromwell became a celebrity in the press during the 1640s. Parliamentary newsbooks praise his military victories to the hilt, but they also commend the kind of discipline that he exercises in his army. It's a praying army, they tell us, and this contrasts to the indiscipline of Prince Rupert's army.
The first big test of the new army, and Cromwell's chance to prove himself against Prince Rupert, came in June 1645 at the Battle of Naseby in Northamptonshire. One of its chroniclers was Cromwell's personal spin doctor, the printer and journalist Henry Walker.
Cromwell led our right wing with our battle cry, "The Lord is our strength." The royalists that led on the left wing called out for the Queen. Rupert entered our left wing, and for a moment it looked as if victory would be theirs. At last we regained the entire battlefield, and God made the king's men stubble to our swords. Upon gaining the field, my Lord Cromwell did say,
"Sir, this is none other but the hand of God, and to him alone belongs the glory."
The victory at Naseby opened a 6-month campaign in which the new model army swept all before it. Rupert's royalist forces melted away. But at Naseby, the godly army did ungodly work. Parliamentary troops plundered the royalist camp, killing and mutilating the women they found there. Many had their noses slit, recognized as a punishment for prostitutes. Loyal parliamentarians were aghast.
Our sinful and wicked armies are now come to be almost as vile as cavaliers. We Londoners put our hearts behind Parliament's cause, and now to see they are ungodly. Must God not be avenged of a nation such as this?
Nehemiah Wallington wasn't the only Puritan appalled at what was being unleashed. The Reverend Richard Baxter had been a chaplain to the parliamentary armies from the beginning. As he walked among the soldiers after Naseby, he was shocked by a new mood of revolutionary fervour.
I found a new face of things, which I had never dreamed of. I heard plotting heads. Proud, self-conceited, hot-headed sectaries had got to the highest places and were Cromwell's chief favourites. I perceived they took the king for a tyrant and an enemy, and intended absolutely to master him or to ruin him.
The revolutionaries were soon enjoying a propaganda victory. In a box they'd looted from the royalist camp, they found the king's personal letters to his queen. They show a king that loved his Catholic wife and did not rule her.
This represents a wonderful propaganda opportunity for the Parliament. They put the letters on in an exhibition in London to prove that they're authentic, and then they publish the text of these letters in a pamphlet called The King's Cabinet Opened.
My dear, I give thee power to promise in my name, to who thou thinkest most fit, that I will take away all the penal laws against Roman Catholics in England, just as soon as God shall enable me to do it.
The publication of the King's letters captured at the Battle of Naseby is so explosive because it reveals Charles as the sort of person his enemies had always said he was, as somebody with a scant regard for his people's opinions and their liberties, prepared to negotiate with the Irish and the French behind their backs for Catholic troops, and prepared to sneer at his people while doing so.
The outcome of the publication of these letters is further to weaken Charles's position. It not only undermines his reputation as a ruler, it takes some of the shine off monarchy itself, because it shows that the king has a personal life, because it shows that he is flawed.
On April the 8th, 1646, news arrived at Oxford that the Parliamentarian army was closing in. The royal chaplain knew they had to move quickly to save the king.
About midnight, His Majesty came, and Mr. Ashburnham cut off his hair and some part of his beard. It was a most pitiful sight.
They prepared him for a secret getaway, hacking off the royal tresses and dressing him in rough clothes. A king once looked upon as a deity by his people, took to the road in disguise as a common man. In May 1646, Oxford, Charles I's Civil War capital, surrendered to Parliament. The Civil War was over, but worse was to come. Richard Baxter, a chaplain in the new model army, recorded the state of the nation.
Nothing appears to our sight but ruin. Families ruined. Congregations ruined. Cities ruined. Who weeps not when all these bleed?
Tens of thousands of men had fallen in combat. Disease would kill a further 100,000 men, women, and children. Families had been split, communities destroyed or divided, and to most, it seemed that nothing had been achieved. The countryside was full of soldiers on both sides who hadn't been paid for months. They had to scavenge for food and lodging where they could find them. Samuel French was a farmer. He needed his horses to farm his 50 acres. Royalist soldiers took them from him. Although barely literate, he wrote a letter of protest to the local garrison.
They possessed my horses continually until I had nothing to maintain me and my fond wife. Then I was told I had to give 4 shillings to pay your soldiers. Since I did not have the money, they took my shovel, whereof I am no longer able to keep myself, and my family go hungry.
The soldiers, having emptied all the town of what was worth carrying away, now kept a fair and sold the things that would sell, inviting us to buy what they had taken. We children are ready to starve from want of bread.
These beasts spend their time in dicing, drinking, and other abominations. Then they possess themselves of our beds and fill them with lice. Soldiers came to South Brent, set a sword to a woman's throat, and bid her fetch a rope to hang her man. Then, using many oaths, they forced him to give them 20 shillings.
The king's escape had been short-lived. He surrendered himself to the Scots, hoping they would protect him. Instead, the Scots sold him to the English. He was held under parliamentary guard near Northampton. The country was now ruled by Parliament. Its MPs passed laws for a national Puritan church to replace the Church of England. But many parliamentary soldiers had fought in order to be rid of a national church. They were not happy with this Parliament.
Parliament and the army fall out, partly because Parliament treats the army very badly. It simply hasn't got the cash to pay everything it's promised it, and so it tries to disband it as fast as possible. And without the money and without the security for civilian life, the soldiers had been told to expect.
Parliament was rapidly losing control. The soldiers who had delivered victory knew Parliament wanted them to disband. But they were not ready to be tossed aside.
This army that brought peace and safety to the Parliament and kingdom with their lives and estates is now undervalued, dishonoured, and despised. I would fain know what the soldier hath fought for all this while. He hath not fought to give power to men of riches, men of estates, to make him a perpetual slave.
The more rebellious the army became, the more it suited the king. Charles was negotiating terms which would let him stay on the throne. Parliament was insisting he accept Puritanism as the national religion. In June 1647, the army took the king into their own custody. Parliament had been sidelined. Cromwell now negotiated directly with Charles I. The army commanders wanted a settlement that gave Protestants freedom of worship, and they wanted a say in decisions of state. Initially, the king negotiated as if he held all the cards.
Surely you cannot be without me. You'll fall to ruin if I do not sustain you.
But gradually, he seemed willing to accept the constraints Cromwell wanted on the monarch's absolute power.
This army speaks to me very fair, that makes me hope well. Sir, I have as good an interest in the army as you have.
Cromwell in turn assured him the monarchy would be respected.
Majesty, I would say no man can live well or quietly unless the king has his rights.
One of the extraordinary things about Charles I is that he's a learner, and he learns how to charm in the course of the Civil War. And one of the less likely victims of his charm is Oliver Cromwell, because the king comes close to convincing Cromwell, like the rest of Cromwell's army, that he has more in common with them than with Parliament, which had been the paymasters of the army. In other words, he's willing to give them the kind of radical Puritan church settlement they want in exchange for a softer line upon royalist views of the church. In other words, to have more pluralism, more choice.
Believing that a deal was close, Cromwell treated his royal prisoner with kindness. The king's younger children, Princess Elizabeth, Prince Henry and Princess Henrietta Anne, were allowed to visit.
Tell him every day I'll come.
Oh, that is balm to my ears.
My Lord Cromwell tells me that this was the tenderest sight that ever his eyes beheld. The interview between the king and his children. He wept plentifully at it, saying that never man was so wrong as he in his sinister opinions of the king. He now thinks His Majesty the uprightest and most conscientious man of his three kingdoms.
But for all Cromwell's concessions, the king concluded no settlement, and Cromwell now faced a challenge from his own side. Pamphlets appeared petitioning for a more radical outcome to the war. Among the authors was a group called the Levellers.
The poorest he that is in England hath a life to live as the greatest he. And I do think that the poorest man in England is not bound at all to that government, that he hath not had a voice to put himself under.
The Levellers were a genuine revolutionary movement. Their pamphlets asserted rich and poor should have the same rights, including the vote. They even questioned whether England needed a king.
The one true king, brothers!
King Jesus! Soldiers' rights! England's freedom!
Soldiers' rights!
England's freedom!
Soldiers' rights!
England's freedom!
It wasn't just men who now demanded a say in the nation's future. Women became preachers for the first time, and they also petitioned for the vote.
We, the assistants and co-equals of the famous citizens of London, we free-born women do hereby remonstrate with thoughts such as the famous Cleopatra owned, that we should not be occasioned to strict subjugation to the men of this our kingdom. We have been the defenders of our houses. We have been the organisers of petitions. We do not need to be tethered at the ankle. We now demand a voice for ourselves.
But the revolutionaries were still a minority. For most people in England, such a world was beyond imagination. Newspapers with royalist sympathies worked on creating a climate of fear. They reported the birth of monster babies, two-headed animals, and sightings of giant fish in the sky, ominous signs of God's disfavor. Tired and sick of their upside-down world, people came close to welcoming the king back as their savior. All Charles needed to do was play for time. But Charles felt he'd waited long enough.
In November 1647, Charles breaks jail. He busts away from what had been the quite lenient and quite reverent house arrest under which the army had put him, and escapes the Isle of Wight.
The king's escape was a betrayal Cromwell would never forgive. Just as he was on the verge of securing a settlement, Charles I was driving the country back to war. One of his commanders spoke what many were thinking. While the king lived, there could be no peace.
It was our duty, if ever the Lord brought us back again in peace, to call Charles Stuart that man of blood, to an account for the blood he had shed. A man of blood over head and ears, in the blood of our dearest friends and fellow commoners.
The war that followed was to be renewed with retribution and without mercy. Autumn 1647. Charles I had given his army captors the slip, but within 2 weeks they had him back under lock and key, this time at Carisbrooke Castle on the Isle of Wight. His game of cat and mouse with Cromwell continued. Charles pretended he'd lost interest in the affairs of state. He even began a passionate correspondence with a young woman of the lower gentry called Jane Horwood.
You must invite yourself to dine to Captain Mildway's chamber, which is next door to mine. Here I will surprise you, and between jest and earnest, get you alone in my chamber, where I will smother Jane Horwood with embraces.
It was all a sham. He was using her and others to smuggle letters to loyal supporters who were planning a royalist uprising. On what should have been Christmas Day 1647, noisy crowds demonstrated on the streets of London, Canterbury and Norwich. The Puritan fundamentalists in Parliament had already abolished holidays and substituted days of national humiliation. Now they had banned Christmas, an idolatrous festival.
What this does is to turn festive culture, the way in which the English traditionally have fun, into a recruiting ground for the royalist cause. Suddenly the King's party, which for some people had still been identified with repression, authority, the erosion of liberty, becomes identified with Father Christmas and the Maypole, thereby turning the King into the natural party of fun.
One of the King's most passionate supporters was Sir Charles Lucas of the Essex town of Colchester. Lucas was described as a man of overbearing dispositions and dissolute habits. He loathed all Puritans. He had good reason. At the start of the Civil War, a parliamentary mob attacked the Lucas family home. They'd broken into the crypt, desecrating the remains of Sir Charles's newly dead mother and sister. Now the Royalists took their chance. Across England, men like Charles Lucas raised new Royalist armies. Charles I, spinning his web from his comfortable jail, had started a second civil war.
The Second Civil War breaks out because Charles I starts it. He is determined now to destroy Parliament and its army once and for all, and he does so by engineering a quite ingenious coalition between his old friends the Royalists and old enemies like the Scots and like a lot of the more moderate supporters of Parliament. His idea is to surround Parliament and its army with a ring of foes and crush it from all sides.
One engagement above all, in Charles Lucas's hometown of Colchester, saw the war turn on ordinary people as never before. During the 72-day siege, armies on both sides sunk to new depths of barbarity. Sir Charles Lucas moved up through Essex with an army of 4,000 men, raising troops for the king. A parliamentary army, led by Lord General Sir Thomas Fairfax, set out in pursuit of him. The royalist Lucas marched to Colchester, occupied it, and prepared to defend it. His men shut the gates on the advancing parliamentarian army. The townspeople were parliamentarians. Lucas took them hostage. None were allowed to leave, not even women and children. The parliamentarians decided to sacrifice their own supporters in their determination to gain the town. Fairfax ordered his men to attack with burning torches.
Presently began a fearful sight and woeful spectacle of firing all round the walls. The streets on both sides set on fire. So furious were the flames they reached above a house and made terrible bursting and crackling. The red dusky cloud seemed to hang over the town, accompanied with such lamentable outcries of men, women and children that it is beyond expression to relate.
There was no escape. The townspeople were now caught between two armies. Fairfax's attack failed, and the parliamentarians were driven back outside the walls. But they retaliated, digging a gigantic earthwork encircling the entire town. If they couldn't get in, no one was going to get out. Those who tried to get out to forage for food were shown no mercy by the parliamentary army. It was to be a war of attrition. As food ran short, the occupying royalist soldiers stole what there was and left civilians to starve.
The town is in a miserable condition. The royalists search and rifle the houses of the inhabitants.
The royalists search and rifle the houses of the inhabitants for victuals, taking all they can lay a hand to.
Butter is not to be had for under 5 shillings a pound, and cheese almost so dear a rate. Soldiers do seize upon the grain. Soldiers do seize upon the grain at the mills and bread at the bakers, which doth reduce the townsmen to extreme misery.
Horseflesh is now as precious to us as the choicest meats before. The soldiers, all the officers and gentlemen.
The soldiers, all the officers and gentlemen from the lords to the lowest degree are eating nothing else, unless cats and dogs. But we poor are left to scavenge for vermin.
Desperate for help, some of the townspeople strapped reports of their suffering to the bodies of children small enough to escape through the parliamentary barricades. It was dangerous work. One child who was caught had his fingernails torn out. But others got through. The London presses, just half a day's ride from the city under siege, were hungry for news. Colchester was their biggest story yet. Now, for the first time, readers could see events unfold before their eyes in daily reports. The vivid stories, carried out by the boy couriers, were being read across the country as the people of Colchester began to starve.
Now there are no dogs left, for it is the custom of the soldiers to reserve half their ration of bread and in the morning walk the streets, and if they discover a dog, they drop a piece of bread and so draw him on till within their reach. Then with the butt end of their musket, kill the dog and carry him to their quarters to eat.
The poor people sit together in great crowds, clamouring for surrender. The women and children lie howling and crying on the ground for bread.
There was a woman who braved the wrath of the enemy to stand with her small children upon the buttress of the town to beg the parliamentary general release the godly townspeople from their misery.
After 10 terrible weeks, General Fairfax flew kites over the city offering surrender. The starving royalists gave up. 2,000 royalist soldiers had died, but there were many, many more civilian casualties.
It has been 8 weeks of reproach and infamy above all which has passed before it. 8 weeks of the highest dissimulation and hypocrisy, of the deepest villainy and most bloody treasons that any nation was ever cursed with. A year of atheism, infidelity and rebellion.
Men and women had seen on the continent how religion had led to wars marked by ferocious violence. In England in 1648, that's now their experience.
Eight years before, news of the horrors of Europe's wars had fueled the fears that took England into war. With the siege of Colchester, England had no need to look elsewhere for horror. After Colchester, there was to be no pardon for the defeated. General Fairfax had promised an amnesty to the 3,000 surviving royalist soldiers. Instead, they were stripped and led away to slavery in the colonies. Those who stumbled due to sickness or starvation were killed by the roadside. Within hours of the surrender, Sir Charles Lucas, the royalist commander, was put up against a prison wall and shot.
Give fire!
Colchester's a microcosm of England. Second Civil War went against God's judgment. It prolonged the suffering of England. And Charles himself was a man of blood. In starting a second Civil War, he had gone against God's judgment. The siege is a nail in Charles's coffin.
Scripture warns that a king should not be.
On the 28th of January 1649, Puritan fundamentalist Hugh Peters preached a sermon from the pulpit in the House of Commons. His words came from the Book of Numbers.
So ye shall not pollute the land wherein ye are. For blood, it defileth the land, and the land cannot be cleansed of the blood that's shed therein, but by the blood of him that shed it.
For men like Peters, the execution of the king had now become a religious duty. Through all the 8 years of civil war, wood-turner Nehemiah Wallington had kept a journal so that his children would never forget these revelatory times. Now the final chapter was being written. Wellington and his generation were the first to read the news for themselves and decide for themselves what they believed. They had gone to war to defend their religion and challenge the divine right of kings. But war bred revolution and destroyed what once had been forever. And now there was a debt of blood to be paid.
The land cannot be cleansed of the blood that's shed therein, but by the blood of him that shed it.
The Lord at last will not suffer the king or his posterity to reign. January the 30th, 1649, at 2 o'clock, was King Charles beheaded on a scaffold at Whitehall. And so we came to kill our king.
There's more on Saturday, details coming up. And if you want to know more, hit channel4.com/history right now, where the director and the consultant historian from tonight's programme are waiting to take your questions in a live web chat.
Gentlemen of the jury, we bring before you into judgment this day the murderers of a king.
When the revolution was over, someone had to pay.
That blood cries out to you for vengeance and will not be appeased but by a bloody sacrifice.
The men who killed England's king had a last chance to argue for their lives.
Guilty as charged.
You see a dead man living.
May God have mercy upon your soul.
Taken from transcripts and first-hand testimony, the English Civil War season concludes with the trial of the King Killers, next Thursday at 9 on 4.